Thank you, Joel, for being here in our Jet Reflections monthly series of conversations highlighting art, design, writing, research that demonstrates how members of our Mass Art community have demonstrated the power of art and design to transform our world. So thank you, Joel. Christian Gill, who is an associate professor in our illustration department. I'm really looking forward to talking with you and learning more about your work. And we are meeting during another difficult week in the United States with racial unrest and violence inflicted on our Black community. And I've been thinking a lot about this current moment in the role of artists and designers to lift up and translate, and in some ways offering truths that it seems like we're not able to see without maybe, in some senses, being mediated through the creative lens. And I'm actually wondering how you feel about that. Do you see your work playing a role in this current moment, or how you see your work playing a role in this current moment? I know I'm starting with a really big question to start, but I feel like it's really pressing right now.
You know, the way I've thought about my work since, when I first started drawing comics, it was because my story, all the stories that I was telling painting were failing. And a friend of mine was like, you should think about telling stories. And so, as I was going through the process of learning how to do comics, I stumbled across the story of Henry Box Brown, who was an enslaved African who sold himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia. And I decided to tell his story. And, originally I was thinking about this as like ways in which to tell stories that like hipsters would like, right? Hipsters will spend, $10 on avocado and toast. I think they'll buy comics about this stuff, right? So like, it was just like, these are the people who I can get my widget to buy my widget, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I went to my first book signing after Strange Fruit was published. And still thinking like really interesting stories that people have forgotten about, right? Like these are stories that people have forgotten about, and I want to get them out there. And this man came up to me at the bookstore, and he had like tears in his eyes, and he was like, well, his he was welling up, and he was like, thank you for telling these important stories. And I took what I was doing seriously, but not understanding the power that this would have for some people. And it really sort of changed the way I thought about what I was doing and about how stories really have the power to humanize and to create empathy in communities. And I thought, at that moment, I thought that my platform gave me a unique opportunity to share these stories in the same way you have a cup of coffee with someone.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a cup of coffee and when we used to be able to have a cup of coffee with people, right? Like you sit down and you talk and you say, I like this thing, I went to this school. This is what it was like for me growing up. Like you humanize things, right? Like we've all heard that story about the person who like, I was homophobic until I met a gay person, or I was racist until I met Black people, or, like those people, when you have that conversation and you get that empathy, and now you have a changed perspective on people. And I thought that using my platform to tell the stories of Black people that had not been told gave me an opportunity to be on a macro level, to have that conversation with people, to open up those things. And so, it's about, for me, it was always about how the power to tell stories really shares a piece of our community and our shared society and community that people have not thought about, or not thought about in the way that I'm thinking about. So I feel like it's my responsibility I want to tell these stories, and I think it's important to tell these stories, but I think the broader understanding about how these stories works basically weaves a narrative about what American history is and what it means to be American, that people have completely set aside and said that you're a hyphenated American. And in reality, we are Americans, right? Like this is Black people in America have a story that is quintessentially American, and that's the story that I'm trying to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, they're, this current moment seems like the most important story to tell for me, kind of thinking about it. Um, I'm also wondering if, Joel, you can talk about your origin story as an artist. Is there a moment you can describe or you remember that defined your creative path? I don't know, however you want to answer that question.
So my origin story, I mean, I am just like all kids, right? I was just like everybody else, and that I drew up until I was about age 12. And I think that it was at 12 that I decided that I needed to figure out what noses actually looked like, as opposed to just drawing like a rectangle or a triangle, right? And I remember sitting in front of the television, years before. I mean, it wasn't before. It was like we were poor, so we didn't have a video. We didn't have a VCR at that point. But sitting in front of like Saturday morning cartoons and drawing every single nose, just like trying to figure out how to get those things out. And then there was a period in time when I was in high school that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I was really interested in history, and I was really interested in politics at the time. And I'm like, I should go into law. And my wife's stepdad is a lawyer. And so this was like, we had a government day where I actually got to shadow a judge throughout the entire day. And I'm like, this would be really cool to be a judge and to be a lawyer. And then I spent like a little bit of time with my wife's stepdad and in his law office. And it was so boring. It was not at all Law and Order. It was not like, it was just not that. And it really changed the way I thought about things. And I had been drawing comics and thinking about telling stories at that point. So it was like, so I originally wanted to draw comics, and then I fell in love with painting for a long time. And so I spent a long time painting. But it was understanding that, it's funny, like if I could not paint, I would have been a lawyer. If I could not draw, I probably would have been a lawyer. And so it seems like the work that I do now about telling these stories and doing nonfiction comics is like the perfect vehicle for my love of storytelling, my love of like history, and my love of politics, and sort of putting those things out there and telling those types of stories. So I think it's real, like, I think that's where I would say that my origin story is. It was like this combination of finding like the things that I really love, and then like I'm lucky, my wife tells me this all the time, I'm lucky, like the thing that I think about at night is the thing that I want to get up and do in the morning. It's the thing that I do. And then I go to school and I teach the thing that I love to talk about. So like, it's just like this circle that that's really sort of amazing. But I guess that's my origin story. Like my father-in-law was boring. His job was boring. So.
Well, so can you share a little bit about your painting? How can you describe kind of that time in your life, and maybe some of the challenges or things you learned from your painting?
Painting, I love painting. I don't paint as much. I mean, I wish I had the time to still paint, but now I have so many other projects to do that I just don't really have time to do it. But I wanted to be Basquiat, right? I wanted to be Basquiat. I wanted to make paintings that made people cry. And I spent a lot of time painting figurative work. Most of my work was figurative. It was all my, I did a lot of paintings of my family. I did a whole series of lynching paintings, which sort of spurred the comics that I was doing called Strange Fruit. I did a whole series based on Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit. And so that ended up being sort of the catalyst for the comics that I was making. No, I mean, like painting people always ask me, this is a common question that I get about how does painting influence how did painting influence my comics? And I'm like, it does influence comics because like a lot of the color that I think about, the way I learned the color theory that I know came from painting. The compositional skills that I learned came from painting, and it's just like trying to figure out how to dial back how much information and how expressive you want to be in order. And the expression serves a different function now, right? Before the expression and the way in which I worked was all geared around design and composition and sort of activating the picture plane. Where it's about how do I use these same things in function to tell the story, because I need to actually use that in order to tell the story. And so how do I do that? And so that's sort of how it influences me now. It's more about how do I use those things that I used to tell stories when I was painting, to tell stories that are long, that have plot points, and that expressions sort of tell the story. So that's how it works to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. So I'm imagining we've talked about, you brought up Strange Fruit, and we were just talking about before the recording came on, a story I was drawn to, Benjamin Darling and Malaga Island
Yeah.
in Maine, which is really, and all of these stories really are, I heard about a few of the characters, and my 12-year-old son was going through the books, and I said, give me a question to ask Joel. And he was wondering, he's like, well, how long does it take to research? I'm imagining you are in a library a lot, kind of trying to understand. As we talked about earlier, I love history as well. And there's so much we don't know,
Yeah.
just about the world around us. And so just wondering about your process of research and how you find these people. Like, what is the thing? Do you have some criteria that are like, oh, I'm seeing this story? Like, how does it
Yeah,
come
I
to you? Yeah.
don't. So the stories originally came to me when I first wrote the story of Henry Box Brown, because I was researching something. I was researching another cartoonist whose name is Box Brown, and Henry Box Brown's story came up, and so then people started telling me more of stories. So people would come up to me when I was selling these mini comics at comic conventions, and they would say, "Have you heard of this? And have you heard of that?" And I would write them down. And the funny thing happens when you start to do research, especially people who are in the age range that grew up with card catalogs and then converted to computers. Because I grew up originally with card catalogs and then moved to computers. And I tend to think about the internet the same way I think about a card catalog. So I do a different type of search, and I go down these rabbit holes. So what I typically do when I'm researching a story, is if I have an idea about a story, I try to read as much as I possibly can about that person's life and take notes and leave myself breadcrumbs. So like, if it's like copying the link, like saving all of those internet addresses that I looked up for my web search in a folder, and then getting books about that person, reading the books, and doing all of those things until I can actually tell the story. And then I think about interesting ways in which to tell the story. So my newest book, which will be out in February, is Tales of the Talented Tenth, volume number 3, about Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was an enslaved African who stole the Confederate ship, the Planter, and sailed it through Confederate waters to the Union with 13 other people. So he stole the ship and he stole the people. And so I read as much as I could. I read a book about Robert Smalls. I read papers about him. I found firsthand information, specifically newspapers from right after it happened, where they sort of chronicled the idea. And then I found information about him because he was a congressman. He was a businessman. He ended up buying the former plantation that he was enslaved on, and then letting his former captor live on the plantation.
Wow.
Which,
Yeah.
yeah. So Robert Smalls he was the man. And so I try to find that as much information as I possibly can, and then I try to figure out how to tell the story. And for Robert Smalls' story, it's a heist story, right? It's like, how do we steal the ship, and how do we get it to how do we steal the ship and us and get them somewhere else? And so that's the way I tell that story. Whereas with Bass Reeves's story, I wanted to find a really interesting hook. For that one, that was Tales of the Talented Tenth, #1. And one of the people he had to, or Bass Reeves, who was the most successful U.S. Marshal in American history, a former enslaved African, he had to arrest his son. So like I told the story around arresting his son. With Bessie Stringfield, which is the second book in the series, she was the first Black woman to crisscross the United States on a motorcycle, and she did it in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so for her story, it was just her telling the story of her life. She's telling it to her interviewer. So it's kind of like it's all in flashbacks about those stories. So I just try to find different ways to to find the hooks for those biographies for people. With Strange Fruit, those are more short anthology biographies, like here's what's happening in that person's life, as opposed to the long form biographies, which are, trying to find some kind of a story to tell that's not just this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. The thing that sticks out for me in most of my stories is I try to find things that are not just like the first Black person to do X or the first Black person to do this, because I feel like it's boring. I try to find the ones that are the most the most incredible story, like a Black woman. Bessie Stringfield wasn't the first woman to crisscross the United States on a motorcycle, but she was a Black woman who was driving a motorcycle in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Like, that's an amazing story, right?
Right.
Robert Smalls wasn't the first slave who escaped. He just happened to steal a ship when he did it, right? Right. Bass Reeves wasn't the first Black deputy. Bass Reeves was amongst a number of Black deputies, including a bunch of Native American deputies called the Light Horse Brigade, which most people don't know about those guys either, which were like deputies that were basically on the reservation by the U.S. government that were called the Light Horse Brigade, and they would arrest outlaws in the Old West. Yeah. Bass Reeves was amongst those people, and he just happened to do some amazing things. Like, he caught more criminals, like 4,000 criminals over the course of his career. He only shot one person. These are amazing stories, right? Yeah. Even if you take out the fact that these are Black people and you replace them with white people, they're still amazing stories.
Right.
Sort of like they're just elevated because they're doing it in a time in which they weren't even really considered people, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
That's the thing that that's what attracts me to those stories, and that's what I look for when I'm trying to do those stories.
Yeah, I mean, just as you're saying that, it just, the description you gave, I'm like, when's the major motion picture, right? Like, any of these like you said, kind of, they're incredible stories just as stories.
Yeah.
And so,
soon is amazing.
Soon, okay.
I have one offer in my inbox, and I'm waiting for.
All right, good.
I'm waiting for another call, so I've got an offer.
Yeah.
And I'm waiting for a call I'm waiting to set up a meeting with somebody else to have a conversation.
Well, good, because I mean, just as these stories have been buried, essentially, right? You're unearthing them, and the representation of our history and Black history has been so it needs that elevation of a major.
Interesting because these stories aren't buried, right?
Yeah.
The thing that I've come to understand. This was actually with a conversation with my mom, who lives with me, who's 73, grew up in the segregated South. And we were talking about all of the celebrations, like we were like this push to celebrate Juneteenth in America, right? I didn't learn about Juneteenth until I was in high school. I went to a predominantly Black high school, and I was talking to my mom about it. I was like, we didn't celebrate in our part of the South. We didn't celebrate. She was like, well, I always celebrated it. And I'm like, no, we didn't. She was like, well, we always did it in school. And it dawned on me, my mom went to a predominantly Black school. She went to a segregated school. And so Black history in a segregated school was real. It was a real part of the curriculum. It was a real part of pedagogy. And when we desegregated the South, it wasn't a real integration. It was more of an assimilation, right? Like, we're not going to take the stuff that you were doing in the Black schools. You're just going to come over here and do the same thing, do the stuff that we do now. So it was more of assimilationist, right? And so I came to this realization that there's an entire generation of Black people who know these same stories because they were taught them before, who had the same stuff that was giving them. And what we didn't do when we quote unquote integrated the schools was real integration. Look at what people are teaching, looking at what they were learning, and taking those things and embedding them into our pedagogy, which is what I think we need to do now, right? Like this is a reason that we should, look at pedagogy across the board about how we incorporate these things so that they're a real representation, as opposed to just getting a brown person and saying, like, as long as a brown person is in charge of a thing, everything is fine now. But that's just not the way it works, right? We need representation, which is embedded into our systems, and which means that we have to look at like how we teach art history, how we teach a lot of things. And that's the moment that we failed in America. We failed it a couple of times. We failed it after 1877 with the end of Reconstruction, and we failed it in the 1960s and 70s with assimilation, not integration. If at any of those points we had looked at a real integration of how we look at society, a real integration, a real coming together of Black culture and white culture, as opposed to not in a way that is exploitative, but like, let's look at the best of these things and put them into our society, we would have actually gotten somewhere in this country. And the reason that we haven't is because we keep not doing that. We keep not acknowledging it. Like for example, the biggest export that American has as part of culture is hip hop, right? Which is definitively Black music, right? But when you look at the beginning of hip hop in the late 70s and early 80s, it was very, very integrated. Like a lot of Jewish and white people were definitely involved in like the beginning. It was a real clear like racial unity in that was seen as just Black music. And now that it's exported, it's the number one music in America. Black people make up 13% of the population, but we make up how much of the culture? And not taking that into consideration and using that to look at the way we teach and the way we educate and the way we look at art and history and politics, and not thinking about those kind of things, is going to keep us segregated.
And to your point, I think the way that the school system and maybe even the country has looked at it is relegated it to, I'm going to give you back your words, to the 28 days.
Yes.
You have that talk, 28 days are not enough. And, because I think the way that you're describing it, it hasn't been integrated. It's been relegated to Black History Month. It's been relegated to Asian or Hispanic History Month, or whatever it is. I can't keep track of what months are supposed to be what groups at this point. So
it's like you think about it. When Carter G. Woodson created Black History Week, right, which was at first a week, and it was supposed to celebrate Douglas's and Lincoln's birthday in February. And then it was expanded into 2 weeks. And when Nixon recognized it nationally in the 1970s, it was because of the Black Student Union at Kent State, at the Kent State University, I think is where it was, right? And I understand all of that. I understand that those are all positive progress, but I think they missed the point where you we don't need a separate thing, right? We need that what we've done in this country up until this point to be acknowledged, right? The idea that people have told me to go back to Africa, my family, there are rumors, and I don't know if this is true because I don't spend much time doing the ancestry or those DNA things, that my family can date back to 1619 when the first enslaved Africans were coming to America. That means that before this country was a country, we were here, right? And to say that, somebody who came during Ellis Island in the 1920s, who just after a generation no longer has an accent and they eat burgers and fries and are now, considered and white because they're white, they're American, and I'm not because I'm Black. Like, that's the thing, like, recognize what we've done. And then the histories that I'm telling will no longer be uncelebrated.